Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello learners, today we are going to learn about various forces of evolution. This is the fifth module under the paper Evolutionary Biology, where we are going to discuss about various forces of evolution, particularly the qualitative ones. I am Dr. Sudhir Verma, working as Assistant Professor in Department of Zoology, Deen Dayal Upadhyay College, University of Delhi. So in today's lecture, we are going to learn about various types of natural selection. Though we have previously seen what natural selection is and how it operates, but now we are going to discuss about various types of natural selection. Then we'll discuss about other type of selections as well, which includes the group selection, which comprises of particularly two phenomena which we name as altruism and reciprocal altruism, and the kin selection. After that, we'll discuss about sexual selection, then frequency dependent selection, and lastly, we'll talk about how adaptive resemblances act as force of evolution. So, let's start what we mean by the selection as such and how selection acts as a force of evolution. By word selection, we here mean the natural selection only, and this selection acts on all the organisms. So it is not specific to a particular type or a group of individuals, but it acts on all the organisms on Earth. Also, it can act on any life stage in the multicellular organisms. It is not restricted to a particular stage of life within the organism. Instead of that, it operates throughout the life of the organisms. It modifies structural, physiological, behavior phenotypes. Means it is not again restricted to a particular branch or a particular type, but it modifies all the type of phenotypes. Also, it leads to differential survival and reproduction. So, keeping this points about selection in mind, let us move ahead to discuss what type of selection can operate on the organisms which brings out the evolution. As I just mentioned, we are going to discuss different types of selection. We'll start our discussion with the natural selection, but we'll focus more about the types of natural selection. These types can be the stabilizing selection, disruptive or diversifying type of natural selection, and third one is directional type of natural selection. Besides these three types of natural selection, we do have other selection type as well, which includes the sexual selection and the group selection. Group selection again comprises of two types. One is called as altruism and the reciprocal altruism, and the other one is called as the kin selection. Besides that, there is something called frequency dependent selection also, which again can be both positive type as well as negative type. So let us first discuss about these types of selection, then we'll move ahead towards adaptive resemblances as source of evolution. Natural selection is of three types as I just mentioned, and these three types have been named as stabilizing selection, directional selection, and third one as diversifying or disruptive selection. So before we move ahead with these types of natural selection, let me just quickly recapitulate what we have already learned about natural selection in our previous lectures. Natural selection as a force of evolution was given by Charles Darwin. You all are aware of now theory of origin of species by natural selection as given by Charles Darwin. Surprisingly, around the same time, Alfred Russel Wallace also developed essentially the same theory but independently. The two theories as given by the Darwin and the Wallace were communicated to Linnean Society of London in 1858. Here you can see both Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, and these lines briefly summarize what do we mean by natural selection. It says that excess reproduction and limited resources lead to competition, which because of natural variation and the natural selection allows those best adapted to pass their characters to the next generation. So it clearly says that there is always an excess reproduction, but resources are limited, which ultimately leads to competition. And this competition can be intraspecific competition, interspecific competition, and the competition with the environment as well, which ultimately because of natural variation and the natural selection allows only those individuals which are best adapted to the environment to pass on their characteristics to the next generation. So that means only those are reproductively fit. Let us talk about the basic postulates of natural selection. As you can see here, there is a reproductive ability in all the organisms. By reproductive ability, we mean that the increase in the number is always in a geometric progression. But the resources which are present at any time are limited. Limited because they can increase only in arithmetic progression. So there is always an environmental restrictions. Under these environmental restrictions, in spite of having this reproductive ability, there will be a struggle for existence and thus the competitions. Now these competitions, as I just mentioned, it can be within the members of the same species as intraspecific competition. It can be interspecific competition, that means the competition between the members of two different species, or it can be the competition with the environment as well. Along with the heritable variations means the differences in the genetic traits, as you might aware of in last lectures we talked about the variations as the raw material of evolution. So in the light of variations which is already existing in the population, there operates the phenomena of natural selection, which we commonly are aware of with the term survival of fittest, though the term survival of fittest was not given by the Darwin but by the Herbert Spencer. Along with the environmental changes, these natural selection or survival of fittest lead to the phenomena of evolution. So this is the crux or the summary of natural selection, or you can say the basic postulates of the theory of natural selection. Now, having this much idea, let us move ahead towards understanding what do we mean by different types of natural selection. The first type is called as stabilizing selection. Here, there is a favoring of an average phenotype and it selects against the extreme variations. That means in a population which has a variety, which has a variation existing in it, only the phenotypes which are on average side, they are being selected or favored. Whereas the natural selection excludes or eliminates the extreme variations. The second type, which is called as directional selection, it favors a single phenotype, causing the allele frequency to continuously shift in one direction. So it keeps on changing in one direction. The third type, which is called as disruptive selection or diversifying selection, it favors the extreme values for a trait over the intermediate values. So it is totally in contrast to what we learned about the stabilizing selection. Here, the extreme values are being favored, whereas the intermediate ones are eliminated. Let us elaborate on these types of selection. The first which we discussed was the stabilizing selection. If natural selection favors an average phenotype by selecting against extreme variation, the population will undergo stabilizing type of selection. Now let us try to understand with an example. The clutch size of robin bird. Now here you can see the robin bird and this is the clutch size, that means the average number of individuals or the eggs that it lays down. There is a limited clutch size and specifically most of the time it is the 4 eggs in the robin bird. It ensures maximum survival of offspring. How? See, if the egg number is more, it will lead to malnourishment in the chicks which are going to develop. And on the other hand, if the egg number is less, predation or disease can wipe out the entire batch. So the individuals which are laying down average number around 4, they are going to be favored, whereas the ones which are having less number of eggs, or the ones which are having the higher number of eggs, that means both the extreme ones, will be eliminated. If you see graphically, on the x-axis if we show the phenotypic measurement, and on the y-axis if we show the number of individuals, generally we have a bell-shaped curve. But this bell-shaped curve under the stabilizing selection changes something like this. That means it gets narrowed down because this portion is being favored. These are the individuals which are on average type, and thus they are being favored, whereas the ones which are on extreme, that means the ones which are laying down less number of eggs or the high number of eggs, they are being eliminated. So the original population which is shown as blue here, it turns to this type of graph, which is the population after natural selection. So we can say that stabilizing selection results in a decrease of a population's genetic variations because both the extremes are being eliminated and only the average phenotypes are being selected. The second type is called as directional selection. When the environment changes, populations will often undergo directional selection, which selects for phenotypes at one end of the spectrum of existing variation. And the very common example we can cite here is of industrial melanism in the peppered moth or distant Batuteria. Prior to industrial revolution in England, the light colored moths were able to blend in with the light colored trees. Just assume this condition. This is the light background, and here the peppered moth, which exists in the two forms, which is the dark form and the light form. The light colored moths are easily able to blend in the light background. But because of soot from the industries with industrial revolution, the trees darkened. So this condition changed to this condition and the background became dark. And the light colored moths became easier for predatory birds to spot. As you can see here, the light colored moth, which was not so much visible in this light background, but with this dark background arrival, the light colored moth is easily visible to the predators. Over time, the frequency of the melanic form of the moth increased, as it is not so easy to identify the dark colored moth in the dark background because their darker coloration provided camouflage against the sooty tree. So selection is going in one direction here from the light form. Now this is going towards the dark form, or it can go vice versa depending on the conditions, environmental conditions. Again, if you see graphically the same graph, under the influence of directional selection, it shifts towards one extreme. So this original population, which was, let's say, majorly favoring light background, light moth under the light background, it is being shifted towards the darker morphological forms. So this shift towards one direction is the reason why we call it as directional selection. And the overall effect is that it results in a shift of population's genetic variance. So it is not decreasing the variance, but it is shifting the variance, unlike your stabilizing selection. The third type is called as disruptive or diversifying selection. If natural selection selects for two distinct extreme phenotypes instead of the intermediate phenotypes that each have their advantages, it is called as disruptive or diversifying selection. And as you can notice here, it is totally opposite to what we discussed about the stabilizing type of selection. Here you can take an example of rabbit fur, which is in three different colors: the white, the black, and the gray, which has the black and white combination. If these three phenotypes reside in an area with black and white rocks, the gray fur rabbits will stand out in both and easily be predated, because if the rock colors is white or black, the white colored rabbit can hide in the white rocks, the dark colored rabbit can hide in the dark rocks, but this gray form will be visible in both the types, that is dark as well as light. So both the extreme phenotypes here are being selected or favored, but this one is going to be at the disadvantage. Again, the same graph, if you see under diversifying selection, it reduces this average phenotype, whereas both the extremes are being favored or selected. So there is a depression at the center point of this graph, and this kind of graph emerges out. So we can say the disruptive or diversifying selection results in an increase of a population's genetic variance. So in summary, we can say the stabilizing one decreases the genetic variance, the directional one shifts the genetic variance, whereas the disruptive or diversifying selection increases the population's genetic variance. Now let us move ahead to the next type, which is called as sexual selection. Sexual selection is a type of natural selection only, but here members of the sexes acquire distinct forms because members choose mates with particular features, or because competition for mates with certain traits succeed. So it means, unlike natural selection, which is being operated on both male and female, in the case of sexual selection, it is the selection between the two distinct forms or the sexes in the sexually dimorphic individuals. Members of the less limited sex, usually which is the males, compete among themselves for access to the limiting sex, which is usually the females. The limiting sex, or the females, is the sex which has the higher parental investment, which therefore faces the most pressure to make a good mate decision. Most of the time, it is the females which invest more in bringing out the offsprings. So, the decision lies with the females which male they are going to choose for mating, and hence this kind of selection operates in nature. The sexual selection often results in the development of secondary sexual characteristics which help to maximize a species' reproductive success, but do not provide any survival benefits. So, sexual selection is not about the survival benefits, but it is all about the reproductive success. And it thus leads to something which we call as sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism is a physical difference between male and female individuals of the same species. Now, I'll show you some of the examples which you can appreciate to understand the phenomena of sexual dimorphism and thus the sexual selection. Here you can see a mandarin duck pair is being shown. Now, in the first sight, you might feel that they are two different species, but believe me, they are mandarin ducks of the same species only. Here, the male, which is so attractive here in terms of appearance or phenotype, is this one. Whereas on the right side, this is the female, which is just a dull fur or phenotype kind of situation. On the other hand, here it is a common quiescence. This right one is the male and this is the female. So as I just mentioned, most of the time it is the males which are being selected by the females. So males do acquire certain characteristics which can attract the females for getting selected so that they can have a reproductive success. It is not only about the birds, or it is not only about the physical attractiveness. It varies along a range of spectrum of characteristics. For example, the sexual dimorphism in Irish elk, the Megaloceros giganteus. Here you can see this is the male and this is the female, which is not just smaller as compared to male, but you can see the antlers here in the males. So it is all about the strength which is there, that is being selected by the female. The northern elephant seals with males having large proboscis and almost 10 times more weight than the females. Here this is the male which is on the right side, and here this is the female which is on to the left side. Sexual dimorphism varies widely among species. In some cases, females tend to have a greater variation in their reproductive success than males and are correspondingly selected for the bigger body size and elaborate traits, usually characteristics of males. So it is not always the males which are being selected by the females, it can be the vice versa situation as well. Here you can see the example of a spider which is called as Argiopensa spiders. Female is the one which is onto the left side here, which is of much larger size as compared to the males, which is of very small size as being seen in this image. Females mate with bigger or stronger or more decorated males. This variation in reproductive success generates a strong selection pressure among the males to obtain those matings, resulting in the evolution of bigger body size and elaborate ornaments in order to increase their chances of mating. Now, because of this pressure of sexual selection, there is an evolution which is resulting, and this evolution is going towards bigger body size or elaborate ornaments or the body strength and so on, so that they can have better chances of being selected and thus the chances of reproductive success. Females, on the other hand, tend to get a handful of selected matings. Therefore, they are more likely to select more desirable males. So this is how the sexual selection acts as a force of evolution. Now there is something called handicap principle also in sexual selection. Sexual selection can be so strong that it selects for traits that are actually detrimental to the individual's survival, even though they maximize its reproductive success. So on the one hand, the trait is providing reproductive success to individual, but on the other hand, it is detrimental to individual survival. For example, let's take the example of male peacock. As you might have seen, the male peacock has very beautiful tail and attractive colors or the phenotype, whereas the females are very much dull, small sized with not that elaborate tail. Now this male peacock tail with largest, most colorful tail gets selected by the female, but it makes the male slower in their attempted escapes. So on one hand, this is useful for reproductive success since they are being selected by the females, but on the other hand, they are at the disadvantageous condition because of this heavy tail, they are unable to get escape from the predators. There is some evidence that this risk, in fact, is why females like the big tails in the first place. Because large tails carry risk. Only the best males survive that risk, and therefore, the bigger the tail, the more fit the male is. And that is how, and this is the reason why females select the males with the bigger tail. Because if they are having bigger tail and still surviving, that means they are more fit. This is known as the handicap principle in sexual selection. Now let us move ahead to third type of selection, which we call as group selection, under which there are two phenomena which we are going to discuss. One is called as altruism and the reciprocal altruism as well, and the second one is called as kin selection. Group selection is a form of selection acting on the attributes of a group of related individuals. in competition with other groups instead of only on the attributes of an individual in competition with other individuals. So here the selection pressure is not operating on the individuals, but it is acting on the whole group as such. It produces adaptations that benefit the group rather than the individuals. Now let us take an example of reproductive restraint as an example for group selection. If all the individuals in a group reproduce at the maximum rate, the offsprings might overeat and exhaust the food supply, leading to group extinction. It can be avoided by collective restraining of reproduction. So if all restrain themselves to reproduce, they can keep the number of offsprings limited and they can avoid the extinction, because if the offsprings are not there, they will not eat the food and food will remain there for the survival of the group. But natural selection on individuals does not favor this reproductive restraint. Within a group, if some individuals produce more offspring than the others, the former will proliferate. This is how we have learned about the natural selection. For the Viney-Edwards theory, which is of the reproductive restraint as an example of group selection, in order to be correct, the selection on groups must be weaker than the selection on individuals. So this is a very fine example to show how group selection and the natural selection operate. Altruism is the behavior that benefits the reproductive success of other individuals because of an actual or potential sacrifice of reproductive success by an individual, which is called as the altruist. Fitness of effects of altruism on the altruist or the performer may be negative compared to the selfishness, but are positive for others in the population group. So the individual who is showing the altruistic behavior, who is sacrificing his or her own reproductive success for the benefit of the group, if you compare it with the selfishness, it fitness effect might be negative, but it is going to have positive effects for the other members of the group or the population. For example, when a monkey loudly screams encountering a leopard, it appears to gain the attention of leopard and thus risk its own life. But by doing so, it signals other monkeys in the group to take a refuge. So in the first sight, when a monkey screams on seeing a leopard, we believe that it is getting the attention of leopard and thus it is putting its own life to risk. But in fact, it is actually giving the signals to other monkeys in the group so that they can take a refuge. Other example you can take of the flower beetle, which is called as Tribolium confusum. Its egg-eating cannibalism by larvae declines in the groups in which larvae feed on the genetically related eggs. Such altruistic behavior of refraining from cannibalism enhances the survival and reproduction of related individuals, which would otherwise be considered as prey. So these two examples very well show what do we mean by the altruistic behavior occurring in the group. Now there is a similar term which is called as reciprocal altruism. The concept of reciprocal altruism was introduced by Robert Trivers in the year 1971. Reciprocal altruism is the phenomena where individuals cooperate only with those who also cooperate with them. So it is just a tit for tat kind of strategy. They are going to cooperate with you only when you also cooperate with them. According to Trivers, though altruism is dangerous for the altruist, but if it is reciprocated by the recipients of altruistic act in the group, it might have significant benefits for the altruist. So in one incidence, probably for the altruist, this altruistic behavior might appear as negative, but if the altruist know that I'm also going to be benefited by other members in the future, That means I'm also going to be reciprocated by the altruistic behavior by the other group members. It leads to a significant positive effect. You can easily understand this reciprocal altruism with this flow chart. If I receive a favor from you, I notice the favor and I feel happy. Now there are two ways I can behave. I can feel obliged to do a favor to you, or I like you and want to do you a favor. That means I am going to reciprocate the behavior to you. So you also like me. There is a positive reinforcement, and you are likely to do me favor in the future as well. Whereas I can behave in other way also. I don't feel obligated to do you a favor back. Means there is no reciprocation, and thus you notice as being cheated, or there is a lack of reciprocation. So you don't like me, and it is very unlikely that you are going to favor me again in the future. So depending on this, you can understand what do we mean by the reciprocal altruism. If this is the situation of reciprocation, the altruistic behavior is going to continue. There are some prerequisites for reciprocal altruism. Cost of the altruistic act must be lower than the benefits to the altruist. Individuals must be capable of recognizing each other in order to reciprocate later. So in a group, one should recognize that who showed the altruist behavior, or who uh, sacrificed his life or reproductive success for me, so that I can reciprocate him or her in the later part of life. A mechanism for detecting the cheaters must exist. I should be able to know that who has cheated in the group, so that we can avoid showing altruistic behavior to them. Must have reasonably long lifespan in order to re-encounter individuals and to have the chance for reciprocation. So there should be a long lifespan, so that multiple such encounters can occur, so that other people can reciprocate to you. An example of reciprocal altruism is red-winged blackbird males, which help to defend the neighbor's nest. They reduce the amount of defense given to the neighbors when the neighbor's males reduces defenses for their nest. This demonstrates a tit-for-tat strategy, where animals help those who previously helped them. These strategies show the reciprocal altruism. Let's move ahead to the next type of selection, which is called as the kin selection now.